Hey everybody, it's Miss Vincent and it's econ time, and it's time to cover the last topic for Unit 4, which is bank balance sheets. Now first off, remember that it's called a bank balance sheet. That means that anything we have on the left-hand side, which is going to be our assets or represents something that the bank owns of value or money that's coming towards the bank, has to equal what's on the right-hand side, which is going to be liabilities. Liabilities are anything that the bank might owe or represents money that's going out of the bank or leaving the bank. Now, at the heart of bank balance sheets, we have to remember that whenever someone deposits money in their checking account, the bank is required to keep a certain percentage in reserves on hand. Remember, we used the reserve requirement. We talked about that was one of the Fed's tools with monetary policy. And we used that reserve requirement to determine the money multiplier. Now, throughout this unit, I've tried to introduce and use some of the terms we're going to see on the bank balance sheet so they don't seem so weird to us. So on the left-hand side of a bank's balance sheet, we're going to list anything that is an asset to the bank. Remember that assets represent anything the bank owns that has value or any money that could be coming into the bank, like loan repayments. On the right-hand side of a bank balance sheet, we're going to list all of the liabilities or all of the money that could be leaving out of the bank. This could be loans the bank has to pay back to the Federal Reserve, or this could simply be just money in checking accounts that people are going to come back for because, well, you're going to get your money out of your checking account at some point to spend it. Now let's talk about some terms on the asset side of the bank balance sheet that you're going to see on the left-hand side of the bank balance sheet. All right, the first thing you're going to see on the asset side, that's going to be required reserves. This is money that the bank actually has on hand. This is a percentage of the money in people's checking accounts that the bank has to hang on to by law. This is the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement does not apply to savings accounts. It only applies to checking accounts. Right below required reserves, normally you're going to see excess reserves. Well, excess reserves is all of the extra leftover money that the bank is able to lend out. So if you put $100 in your checking account, the bank might have to hang on to $10 if the reserve requirement is 10%, but the other $90 is going to fall under the excess reserve category because that's the leftover money the bank can go loan out and use to increase the money supply. Now, you might also see a category called loans on the asset side of the bank balance sheet. This does not represent loans that the bank has to pay back, like to other banks or to the Federal Reserve. This actually represents the loans that the bank has already lent out to customers. And this is also money that is going to be repaid back to the bank. These loans are on the asset side because it represents money that is coming the bank's way. You also might see a category called securities. Remember that securities was one of those other names for a bond. Now, like we did in the classroom, if you're holding on to a bond, a little piece of paper, that is a promise that whoever you bought that bond from is going to pay you back after a certain time with interest. So sometimes banks can buy bonds from the government. So they're holding on to these securities or these bonds, which represent money that's going to be coming back into the bank at some future point. Finally, occasionally you might see a category that says physical assets. Physical assets is basically going to represent physical capital that the bank owns. It has some value in it. If they needed to sell it for money, then they probably could. Let's talk about the right-hand side of the sheet. That's going to be liabilities. Now, liability is always kind of a bad thing. Instead of money coming into the bank, it's going to be money that is leaving the bank. Now, the first category you're going to always see under liabilities is going to be your checkable deposits. This is the money that's in people's checking accounts. Sometimes it's called demand deposits on bank balance sheets. So don't let that throw you off. It can be checking accounts, it could be checkable deposits, it could show up as demand deposits, but it's usually going to be the first one under liabilities, and that's just the money that's sitting in people's checking account. Now, why is that a liability? Well, people are going to come back to the bank and withdraw their money, right? They're going to withdraw some money to make purchases at the grocery store. They're going to withdraw their money to go on vacations. So in a checking account, money is always coming in and going out pretty frequently. So people are going to be coming to get their money out of their checking accounts, and that's going to represent money that is leaving the bank. Below checkable deposits or demand deposits, you might see other deposits. This is going to represent other types of accounts that people have with the bank. Could be savings accounts, could be certificate of deposit accounts, but these are just going to be other accounts that people have put their money in at the bank. Reserve requirement does not apply to these accounts. It only applies to checking accounts. But these are still considered a liability because at some point, the money that's in your savings, the whole reason why you're saving it is to take it and use it somewhere. So you're going to be getting that money out of the bank eventually at some point. All right, below demand deposits and other deposits, you might see something called other liabilities. Well, that's about as vague as you can get, right? But what this means is, remember, sometimes the banks can borrow money from the Federal Reserve, or they can borrow money from other banks, and they're going to have to repay those loans with the discount rate or with the federal funds rate, right? So when the bank has borrowed money and it has to repay that at some point, that's going to represent money that is leaving the bank as well. And so you might see other liabilities. Sometimes you might see it as loans. Usually you're not going to see loans on the liability side, but this is not loans that the bank has lent out to customers. These are loans that the bank has had to go and get from the Federal Reserve or other banks, and that it has to pay back. The last one that you might occasionally see under liabilities is owner equity. Sometimes maybe there's a little bit of profit that's going to go towards the owner of the bank, or if the bank is owned by different shareholders, then maybe you have to pay some profits to them, or maybe you have to pay some dividends to the shareholders of the bank. Occasionally. Again, though, that's just going to represent money that's going to be going out of the bank. So let's do a little bit of practice with an example. Now, this question says that Bob is going to deposit $1,000 into his checking account. One of the first things that we have to try to figure out is what is the reserve requirement set by the Federal Reserve that this bank has to hold on to. Well, notice that there's $20,000 sitting in people's checking accounts here at this bank, but this bank is only holding on to $2,000 in required reserves. So the reserve requirement is 10%. Number 2 says, what's going to be the immediate change in the M1 money supply? Will the M1 money supply initially increase, decrease, or stay the same? Now, when Bob had this $1,000 in his hand or in his pocket when he walked into the bank, it was M1 money. He's going in the bank to put it in his checking account, which is also included as M1 money. So from his initial deposit, he just put his money in his account. M1 is still the same as it was whenever he walked into the bank. Now, number 3 says, what is going to be the value of required reserves after he makes his deposit? You know, right now, it's sitting at $2,000 for required reserves. Well, he's about to put $1,000 into his checking account. Well, when he puts $1,000 into his checking account, the bank has to hang on to 10%. Or $100, and then they can loan out the other $900. So when Bob puts his $1,000 in his checking account, that's going to be an extra $100 that's going to go towards our required reserves. So now required reserves is going to change to $2,100. Number 4 says, what's going to be the value of excess reserves after he's made his deposit? Well, excess reserves was sitting at $3,000 before Bob made his deposit. When Bob made his $1,000 deposit, the bank had to hold on to $100 in required reserves, but the other $900, the other 90%, that's going to go right into that excess reserves bucket. So now our excess reserves is $3,900. The next question says, how much more can the bank lend out after his deposit? Well, when he made his $1,000 deposit, the bank has to hold on to $100, but it can lend out the other $900. So the bank can lend out $900 more after he's made his deposit. That's why the excess reserves increased by $900. The last question says, what is the maximum change in the money supply that could result from Bob's $1,000 deposit? Well, we're going to use our money multiplier because we're trying to figure out what's the total impact on the money supply from his deposit. Now, we're not going to multiply the whole entire $1,000 that Bob deposited. So of Bob's deposit, only $900 is actually going to go back out into the world, back out into the circular flow to get multiplied. So we're going to do $900 times 10. And so the maximum change in the money supply that could result from Bob's deposit into his checking account is going to be $9,000. Now with the next example, we have the same bank balance sheet, but we're going to be tackling a different set of questions. This setup says that the Fed buys back $1,000 worth of bonds from this bank. Now remember, buying bonds is going to make the money supply bigger. Now how is this going to affect our bank balance sheet? Well, notice that we have a category called securities, which represents the bonds the bank holds. Securities is at $5,000. Now the Federal Reserve is going to buy $1,000 of these securities back from the bank. That's going to decrease the amount in securities from $5,000 to now they're only holding $4,000 worth of little index cards that say IOU. When the Federal Reserve took their index cards away, they gave them $1,000 worth of money. Now, this money is not being deposited into a checking account. This money is just being directly paid to the bank. So, none of this money has to go into required reserve. That means this $1,000 that the Federal Reserve is paying to the bank, it's the whole entire $1,000 is going to be able to go right into that excess reserves bucket. And so that's an extra $1,000 that the bank can now just go and loan out to other people. So the first question asks us, what is the value of required reserves now? Well, required reserves aren't going to change because nothing happened with checkable deposits. The second question says, what's the value of excess reserves now? Well, they just got $1,000 from the Federal Reserve that they can put in that excess reserves bucket so they can loan out to other people. So our excess reserves is going to go up by 1,000. Instead of being 3,000, now it's going to be 4,000. The third question kind of seems a little wordy. How much more can the bank initially lend out? Well, all this really is asking is, what's the extra money in that bucket that the bank can now lend out as a result of this? Well, they just got an extra $1,000 in the excess reserves bucket. So initially, they're going to be able to lend out an extra $1,000. Now the last one says, what is the total maximum change that could happen in the money supply as a result of the Fed buying bonds back from this bank? And so to find out the maximum impact on the money supply, again, we're going to be using our money multiplier. But we don't have to reserve any of this money that the bank got from the Fed because none of it was going in checking accounts. It's just all directly going into excess reserves. So we're going to take that full amount that can be loaned out, that $1,000 that banks can now loan out, and we're going to multiply it by the same money multiplier we used in the last part, which was 10. So $1,000 times 10 is going to lead to an increase of $10,000 in the money supply. Congratulations on finishing Unit 4, the Financial Sector and Monetary Policy. Until later, see you guys.